那不就没用了？
没有资格去做完之前，保为一个
我大概解释一下，这个是手，
它是那个不是那个我忘记说不能个人东西。
你用人来开，他现在
一群老人，四个老人养老院对，四个老人在这个这 TS 就感觉没有感觉，然后打了一个专门的都是对面5个杀了5个，一排就超别。
I don't think we can make it out. Yes, that's well.
这么卡滑下的。泡汤水。不好，因为好招的。什么打麻将也不打，晚上回家刚等了，吃完饭在那儿等。已经有3个了，目标。先找个人教一下，去看他的。没有，北京奥运会，北京奥运会。哪一年的？我还以为最近又搞北京奥运会。我意思是不是就检查嘛？一般要找下车。有几个人就是搞定的名字。
I don't know him.
Morning, everybody.
Morning.
A little late this morning, sorry about that. It's gonna be a couple minutes later because I got to get my cup of coffee.
疫苗我是肯定没有。
跟我室友，跟我大学的室友好像。
歌词一个小
这个我先说，它一个上下游。
我们可以写一个，我们可以写一个写歌词的自动填歌词啊，根据你输入关键词，然后自动写。我们可以弄一个自动写歌词的。
只想唱不想写口，只想唱歌。
Oh, come on.
那个假电是在直接在线上。
Okay, so I want to take the first few minutes to talk about something that you probably don't need for Project 2. You will need for Project 4. You might use it for Project 2. But it illustrates really nicely the things we've talked about this week. So let's think about building a file manager. So we might do something like this. Let me just, this is just pseudocode, okay? Not real code. So search path. So search path says find files, and for each file, notify, whatever the heck that means. And then finders. For each, if I could spell, for each dir, notify, and then search dir. So a nice little recursive navigator. So a nice little recursive navigator. Can you see that in the back row? Both alike? Can you see that okay? Did you ever get an email from me with your project? I fixed it. I don't remember what I did. Okay. It was just 2 or 3 small fixes, But send me an email again, and I think I had a bad email. I just typed in what I thought, I had a bad one. So send me an email, and then I'll just respond. I'll attach what I did for you. You'll have to look at it and compare it to yours to see what I did differently. I don't remember, But it was only a couple of steps, nothing complicated. So, okay, so what notify means is application specific. What do you want to do when the navigator finds a file? What do you want to do when the navigator finds a directory, other than recurse down, maybe? Okay. And so we could blast the code right in there. Okay. Whatever we want to do on this application. And now it's useless for other applications. This is, it's not very complicated. You might actually choose to write it for each application, but it's a nice little thing that you can stick off in a set of utilities and bingo, pull it up. Okay. So how could we make this extensible? Think of what we talked about this week. Are there any chairs? Yeah, there's a chair here. I guess he went away. There's a chair here, over here. Okay. So, what are our options to make this extensible? Well, that's what we want to do, but what are our options? How are we going to do it? I think there's two really simple answers. Okay. Templates or inheritance. Right? I said, how are we going to do it? So I could use an interface. That could be part of my inheritance scheme, but you jumped into it. But we could either use templates or we could use inheritance, right? And we can actually use inheritance in two ways. So let's do it this way. File, if I can pull this up a little higher so I might have a chance of typing correctly. File Manager Extensions. So I can do template, and that's really easy to describe. I make file manager of whatever you want to call it. Let's call it big A for application. Okay, where A has methods do file of name, this string blah 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 blah. I'm not, this is just pseudocode, or do dir of name. Nice, extensible, works fine. No problem at all. Right? Piece of cake. So what the file manager is going to do when he gets to a file, he'll just say a.doFile. And A defines what it is we want to do with that file. And your application supplies A, right? Yes! It's not, what are you talking about? Yes, of course, right? Wei Heng? Not yes, quite yet, huh? I'm going to leave that to you, and you should. If you're not really clear exactly what you do now, then play with it a little bit, okay? It's time for self-discovery. It's time for a little less, Prof told you exactly how to do it, and a little more self-discovery, okay? So that's one clear way to do it. The other way is through inheritance, and there's a couple of inheritance ways. So let's, Welcome back, little Sheba. So now, inheritance. And I could do it this way. I could do it as in file manager provide virtual void do file of name. Again, you know, it needs a string argument, but you supply that. Equals 0 virtual void do dir of dir name equals 0. Okay, I'll leave off the semicolon. This is just pseudocode. And now in the base class, in a derived class, override. So let's be a little more specific. In derived, wish I could type, app file manager, or whatever you want to call it, we simply override, do file, and do dir. Piece of cake. Done deed. There's one issue with this. And that is that I might have different parts of the application that needed different things done. Might. This part of the application needs just to store that information, and that part of the application needs to display it, maybe. Okay. So there's a related way, which is a command pattern, which is inheritance. So provide hook class, what do we call it? AppNav, iAppNav. Let's call it iNav. And provide do file name and do dir name as virtual as pure virtual methods, and then file manager makes calls to iNav bound to application instances that implement iNav. So that means the file manager has to have file manager provides a collection of inav, pointer inav, inav, let me just write it as inavs. Would you do what I want? Inav star pointers, and a registration function that allows applications to register their inav derived instances. This is just a command pattern. Okay? So extensions, as soon as you say the word extensions, templates and inheritance should immediately pop into your head. On the exam, there'll be a question about extensions, and what are you going to do immediately? Right? Templates and inheritance are my techniques that I'm going to use. Okay? Right, Harika? Yes, of course. So, and the difference between, you know, making a subclass is fine, but it's limited by it provides, unless I want to have a whole bunch of subclass, you know, I could subclass it several different times, okay, which is really kind of what I'm doing here in the command pattern, okay, in a sense. But nav might have some other stuff in it, you know, and here we're just, what we're duplicating is this really tiny little, you know, the command part, the inav part. So, easy to extend, piece of cake. These should be knee-jerk reactions for you. And an interviewer asks, now, how would you make that extendable for arbitrary applications? You say, immediately, templates for inheritance, and I might use a command pattern. And they'll smile. Okay. Yes, yes. Right, guys? Yes. So, so do you need this in project 2? Probably not. You know, you do need to do some file stuff, but it's pretty much a programmed stuff, so you don't need to do a lot of searching. But in project 4, you absolutely have a client that's got to find files, you know, to send to the repository and stuff. So, I think you absolutely need it. It's really tiny, not big, you know, so easy to provide. Make sense? In the back row, does it make sense? With the white shirt there, you. Yeah, what's your name? Yeah.
Devin.
Devin. That's your Indian?
That's my real name. Yeah.
That's your real name? Oh, okay, that's not an anglicized. So Devin, okay. What's your last name? Opreti. I have a real hard time rolling my R's. I'm getting closer. I'm jealous. I would like to be able to roll my R's, but I can't. Okay, Devin. I got to use your name about 7 times before I remember. But does that make sense, guys? Okay, good. I'm ready to open the floor for questions. How many of you are going to use my NoSQL database? No, you know, no, it's not. No, you know, it's not bad news. It's okay. It's all perfectly okay. All right. So a few of you are, more than a few of you. So, interesting little dynamic here. You know, nothing wrong. There's no penalty for using mine. What I want you to do, if you use it though, I want you to look at mine carefully and then go back and look at your own and say, what did I do wrong that I can't use it here? Maybe you didn't do anything wrong, it's just a little nicer, you know, that's okay. But that kind of introspection is very valuable. I started writing code a long, long time ago, and not too long ago, I happened to run across some of my old code, and it was awful. It was terrible. But every time, you know, when I complete, almost every time when I complete a project, I look at it and say, am I satisfied with this or not? And if I'm not, why am I not satisfied with it? It's too complicated, or it isn't readable enough, or it isn't expressive enough, or something. Or the data management is, too specific, or something like that. Keep asking yourselves those questions. Keep trying to find good code to look at. There's an awful lot of code out there on the web, and most of it is awful. Ranks right up there with the first code I wrote. Okay, some of it is really good, but a lot of it is really not so good. So, you want to tune your critical judgment, but keep asking yourself, why don't I like this code? I still write code that I don't like. Doesn't happen very often anymore because I've written so much code. But every now and then, I'll look at it and I'll say, this is too complicated. And very often, I'll tear it apart and start over again because I'm not happy with it. But. So let's open the floor for questions. Does anybody have, I've kind of explained how you might want to use my, my NoSQL, okay? So, if you still have questions about that, I'll be happy to answer questions about that. But otherwise, we can talk about Project 2 requirements or whatever you need. Or about the class materials if you need some questions. Hey, if there are no questions, I got lots of work to do. I can go to my, okay, waiting.
When we use your NoSQL database, can we change your code?
Yeah. So what you do when you do, if you just change a character, or if you change a lot, no matter what you do is you list yourself as the author, and you list me as the source. You give me the code, and you should always, not just because it's me, but you should always do that. When you use somebody else's code, but change it. If you don't change it, you leave their name on it. You might say, this code came from, unchanged from, okay, but for my code, you don't need it. Just leave my name, when you submit it for the project, if you use as is, just leave my name on it. If you change a single character, you're the author, I'm the source, and that way I don't get blamed for whatever evil you do to my code. Okay. So, I've had students come to me and say, oh, your code is terrible. I had all kinds of bugs. And I looked at it, and somebody had hacked the hell out of it. It was just a mess. Of course it's buggy. I didn't do that. Don't blame me, please. Questions about requirements? Yes?
Ask a question about your code.
Uh-huh.
In the ipayload.h, so the from XML.
Okay, let me pull up my solution. So, Gesundheit. NoSQL DB. This may or may not be the absolute latest that's on the college server. I didn't do much. So payload, so payload.h. So you want iPayload or payload?
iPayload interface. Yeah. So does this green line matters?
That says, hey, iPayload didn't implement this method, and that's absolutely correct. But this code is correct. It's just that IntelliSense is telling me that this class didn't implement that method, and that's absolutely true. I can't make it pure virtual because it's static. Static methods can't be virtual. Okay? That's why static methods can't be virtual. The language doesn't allow it. So because it can't be virtual, it can't be pure virtual, so I can't tell the compiler I intend not to provide an implementation in this class. So the compiler's telling me you didn't provide an implementation in this class, and I know that, and that's fine, because I'm going to provide it in payload. Okay?
So even if the payload has implementation, so it cannot.
Payload absolutely implements that function. What that green squiggly line says is this class didn't implement that function. And I wouldn't see that if I didn't make it static, I could make it pure virtual, and the green squiggly would go away. But now, when you're going to create a payload object out of the XML, now you have to create a payload object in order to get a payload object, which doesn't make a lot of sense. Okay, that's why I did it that way. And this is another reason I did it is this is a fairly common scenario when you want to do this sort of thing, okay? So I could have moved that creational function into a separate class, but that's just one more moving parts, and I've already got a lot of moving parts in this project. You know, I don't want to have any more. I want it to be as compact as I can make it. So I'm perfectly happy with having that green squiggle there. It's just telling me what I already know, which is perfectly acceptable. Perfectly correct code, okay? Good question, good observation, but.
I see use the persist.h and persist.h, so it is manipulate the generic type P.
So you want to look at persist.h?
Yeah.
Okay, let's look at persist.h. So persist.h does what?
I see on the line, code line 141.
141.
So
Yeah.
for this method, so we use a template type P. So, but 140 line, if I change my database piece to from the payload to std.string, so the 140 line, so because the std.
No, understand this payload is a function in DB element that's going to return the payload, whatever you name it. You don't have to name it payload. This function belongs to DB element, and it's just returning whatever that payload type is. It's returning a reference to that.
But for the other type, it didn't have the function of 2 XML elements. So
No, wait a minute. Payload has a function 2 XML element. It absolutely does.
But for other types, it cannot support.
Payload, look at. iPayload says you must have a 2 XML element and you must have a from XML element. So you change the payload and you don't implement that interface, you don't have a payload. You just implemented a class. It's not a payload. Okay?
Because the payload class is you provide.
Yes, but you have my application payload has to implement from iPayload, so it has to implement 2 XML and from XML. Your my application payload, or your my widget. If you want to use widget as a payload, you can, okay? But now it has to implement the iPayload interface, meaning it has a 2 XML and a from XML.
But can your persist to support std.h as well?
Can my persist support what?
std.string to
No, because it's not a payload. It doesn't implement the iPayload interface. If you wrap the string, so you make a class that just has a string member, but it has the functions 2 XML and from XML. It's really easy to write. Okay.
So if I want this to
payloads have to implement the iPayload interface. If you haven't done that, you didn't do it. Okay. If you want to use a string, wrap it, and so it inherits from iPayload. If you want to use a vector, wrap it, so it. Okay. You with me? Okay. Good. So, pardon me for being vigorous. I'm a vigorous person. Okay. Other questions? Yes.
Professor, could you please explain the fourth requirement?
The fourth requirement. I will if I can. Let's see if I can. Okay. Yes. So, what's your name?
Pranat.
Pranat. P-R-A-N.
M-R-U-M-A-N.
M-R-U-N-A-N. Moran.
M-A-L.
Okay. My ears are too old, so sometime when you're sitting closer, I'll query you and I'll get your name straight. But anyway, so shell support check-in by accepting a single package's files. And if I were doing, this requirement allows you to check in file by file, and I would definitely do that if I were writing this. It's much easier. Okay. Support by accepting a single package's files and append a version number to the end of each file name, like pr5.h. Now, as I mentioned in Piazza, I was chatting with the TAs, and it seemed to all of us, you have to have a unique key. And the key wants to be the file name, but to make it unique, it really has to have a namespace, : file name, dot extension, and then you will append. When you check it in, it doesn't have the version, but the repository will add the version. You're not allowed to, clients are not allowed to supply versions. If you supply versions, you'll wind up with version 1, version 348, version 5468, nothing in between, because some client typed that in. Okay? It'll be totally inane. So you depend on the repository having an orderly sequence. 1 is followed by 2, is followed by 3, is followed by 4, and don't try to give it sub-numbers. Okay? Just nice integer values. All right? So we're literally in the repository. We have this file display : user GUI.h version 3 and display : user GUI dot h version 4. So you have to for those to be unique, so that they don't overwrite each other, which you're not allowed to do. They have to have the extension appended to them. Or, you got to do something. You could create a separate directory, but if you've got 10,000 things in your repository, do you want to have a repository with 10,000 directories? I don't. So that means, I think, it's pretty inescapable that you're going to append the version number at the end of the extension. And by the way, Windows is very happy, and so is Linux, very happy to accept files that are named that way. Has no problem with that. So, you just append it. Now, a package with open check-in can be modified without altering its version number. So you come, let's suppose, first, you don't have any files of that name stored in the repository. So you store one in, and the version, you check it in as open. And I would always do that by default. I would check it in as open. Now, it gets version 1, and I can overwrite that file. I can add dependencies. I can do anything. I would change the description without changing the version number until check-in is closed. As soon as you close the check-in, that is immutable. It's not deletable, and it's not changeable. It's always the same. Okay, guaranteed to be. So that's the model. And now we have all the versions in the repository. And so if I field a product to a customer and it has an older version and they report a bug, I can pull up exactly their code, because I just go to their project, which down links to version 3, but the current version of version 5 links to version 3. I can pull it up, build it, test it for bugs, find the bug. And I might fix the bug by updating the parts, but I might not do that. Okay, depends. But it gives you the option of analyzing fielded code that's older versions. If you don't do that, if you don't save all those older versions, you have a real hard time of fielding customer problems. I worked in the radar business for 10 years just before I came here. I worked in the industry for a long time, but for the last 10 years of that time I worked in the radar business, and we had lots of fielded systems, and we were constantly, a customer reported a bug and we had to pull up that fielded system. We didn't have something as nice as a repository. We would save the thing that we shipped them, got saved like a container, you know, it was saved, and we would pull that up and look at it. But the repository is a much nicer structure. Does that make sense? Did I answer your question? Okay.
Shall we have .1 for the initial version, for the first version?
I'm sorry, show you what?
Shall we have a .1 suffix to the file name for the
I don't want you to use 1.1 or 1.2. I want you to use 1, and then 2, and then 3, and then 4.
Yeah.
Okay?
The first thing is at the 1. I think what he means is
The first one is always 1.
always 1.
It's never 5. Okay? It's 1. Make it 1. Okay? Would you lose points if you made it 0? We wouldn't be that mean. I don't think we'd. We might be, but I don't think we'd be that mean to you know. But make it 1. You know, it's the first version. Why wouldn't it be 1? Okay. It's not the 0th version.
We should maintain different directories for different categories or single directory all the time.
Harika said, should I make a directory for different categories? So now how do I represent a file that belongs to 2 categories?
We can have metadata information about the category.
Then why do you need the directory? If you're going to record it with metadata, why put it in? You know, I think it makes sense definitely to have some directories. And I would probably make my directories, if I was using the database to store work on a particular project, a particular baseline, I would probably have a separate directory for each namespace. Okay.
The node of making the namespace in the key, we can keep in the directory based on the categories, seeing the metadata.
Yeah, the categories are held, well, the categories are held in the payload, not in the metadata. The relationships are held in metadata, but the categories are held in the payload. They should be, you know, because you don't want to make your, you don't want to weld your NoSQL database to the repository application. You just violated the open and close principle, right? Yeah. Yes?
What is the names, in the key, so there is a namespace called the file name. What is the namespace about? What it should be?
If you look at my code, let's look at payload. Whoops, let's look at iPayload. Namespace NoSQLDB. Every one of my files has a namespace. And Visual Studio for C++ files does not, by default, give you a namespace. Visual Studio for C# by default does. Why they have it different is totally beyond me, but you should always use namespaces. Namespaces allow us to disambiguate 2 files, so the display team creates a widget class, and the signal processor team creates a widget class. How do we distinguish them? We distinguish them by namespaces. So the display widget would be display : widget, and the signal processor team's widget would be signal processor : widget. Okay, just to make it unique. And for the same reason, it makes them unique in the repository. Now we have a unique key for each file in the repository.
So the user or the client supports the namespace, or
The user, my model is the user has to know the namespace. Hey, they wrote the code, so they'll know the namespace. You know, if you support multiple users, multiple owner policies, which I don't particularly favor myself, that knowledge may not be so obvious to them, but you know. But anyway, they got the code, they're checking it in, so they look at the code, and what's at the top? Namespace, blah, blah, blah. You know, were I building a repository that I was going to use for the next 10 years, I'd almost certainly write a tool that would go and grab the namespace out of the file, okay? It would grab the file name, grab the namespace, and if there was no namespace, I would put : signifying that it is the global namespace. And I'd put up a little notice, hey Turkey, you don't have a namespace on this file. Okay. Is there anybody here from Turkey? That wasn't an insult for the national insult. That was here. So Kentucky, for example, the state bird is a turkey. Turkey, the bird, turkey, is the world's dumbest creature. They often drown when it rains because they stand up there with their mouths open and they'll drown. Okay. So in this country, when we say, hey turkey, we're saying, you know, you're not being very smart. But I've got to stop using that expression because I don't want to offend people from Turkey. It's not directed at them. Totally different. We've overloaded that word. So this question, and then I'll get back to you.
Yeah, is that possible that one file has two or more namespaces?
They can be nested, and they can also be. So here's a really good question. It's entirely possible to have a file have namespaces in sequence.
Yeah.
I think a good style always is to have one outer namespace. Even if you want two separate ones, a sequence of namespaces, wrap it with an outer one, and you would use the outer wrapper. Okay.
But I used to see in your code there's a bigger namespace on the top, and when you write the main functions, there's another namespace.
There might be a nested. I don't do that very often, but on rare occasions I'll have nested namespaces.
So
just use the outer one.
We can assume that every file just have one.
Well, every C++ file always has a namespace. If you don't declare one, it's the global namespace, and its name is : Oh. Okay. In other words, its name is empty, but it is a namespace, and the compiler treats it like a namespace. Okay. It's just a global name. And everybody, it's common practice to refer to that as the global namespace in the C++ community. Yes, Tian Yu.
Should we, when we're checking a directory which contains files, should we preserve the original directory structure when we're checking?
You're checking in a file at a time.
But if
I don't think you should. My answer is I don't think you should.
So I think when we previously talking about this project, I think you have said that this project should support the user to check in a directory and check in the files in the directory sequentially.
I said for graphical user interfaces, if I create two separate graphical user interfaces with C#, for example, both of them will have an assembly info file, same name, but they have different contents.
Yep.
And so you would have to provide a way to separate those two. One way is to create a directory for the GUI, but perhaps a better way is to simply zip up the whole GUI and check that in. And that's what I think I would do.
What is about the whole GUI?
So I have a GUI, I have a graphical user interface. So if after the spring break, we're going to talk about Windows Presentation Foundation, and we will be building graphical user interfaces. Okay, so it'll be clearer to you. But when you do, you have an application that uses a graphical user interface. There is a WPF project there, and there's a directory for that. And what I would do is I would just zip up that entire directory and check in the zip. Okay. I don't think you should use, if you use a directory structure, then what that means is that navigation gets more difficult. That means that users of the repository have to understand the directory structure. And, I just don't think it's a good idea.
No, what I mean is we shall support checking like a conflict directory, such as a project, which contains.
I think you should check in file by file by file by file. I'm going to say that again and again. I think you should check in file by file by file, as long as there aren't ambiguities as in a graphical user interface. So my repository, here's how I would build it. You would find zip for this GUI, zip for this GUI, zip for this GUI, and then file, 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 file. I might have some directories, but they wouldn't be project directories. What you're doing when you do a project directory is you're saying, anybody who wants to use my code, this is reusable code, if you want to use it, you got to use my directory structure. Okay? And I think that's just a bad idea. I don't want to use I like my directory structure different than yours. I don't want to use yours. So not only do I have to set up my own, I got to tear yours apart. Okay, so I don't think it's a good idea I think it's a good idea to have directories in the repository to separate out, different parts of a project perhaps, but they're not the Visual Studio generated directories. Okay, that's what, okay? Sometimes I get a little too vigorous. I don't mean to offend him. I'm not beating on you. Yes. Ritesh. Okay.
Does that mean that the repository is going to primarily support projects which are C++ based and C# based and not any other kind of?
Oh, I think they should support Java and whatever. But see, the repository mostly, so the model here is that, if I looked across this room at project 2s, at the project structures, you're all using Visual Studio, but there would be a lot of differences in the directory structure. Okay? If you bind your directory structure in to the repository, then anybody else, it's harder for them to use it because they're not using your directory structure. So if you put them, file at a time, these reusable time, imagine if I were saving my XML document, I would have an XML document.h, XML document.cpp, XML element.h, XML element.cpp, all in the same directory. Now, both of you are probably sitting there saying to me, yeah, but those header files depend on that directory structure. So what I would almost certainly do is I will build a little tool that would allow me to easily strip off a directory structure and add it back in to files like that. Easy. A little file that detects pound includes, and so it's easier to strip it off, obviously, than to put it back on. But for example, you might store. Here's a very rational thing to do with your XML. So I'm saving my XML document. So I'm going to save XML document.h to CPP, element.h, element.cpp, XML parser.h, parser.cpp, and there's a couple more. And I would also check in an XML file that described my directory structure, that matched what was in those, the directories. And now, easy to build a little tool to go set up that directory structure and load the files into that directory structure. Okay? I think that's probably what I would do. But I'm not expecting, to take, what we're building is a prototype for a repository. It's demonstrating that this is the right way to do all these complicated things, but it is a prototype. There's a lot of nitty-gritty little details to make it easy to use and smooth to operate and stuff that, you're not going to do, or you wouldn't get done until next August. So, yeah, go ahead.
Thinking a little ahead for the future projects, is there going to be a browse by solution? Because that's something you hit upon.
No, there definitely will be a browse, but not by solution. I don't want this to be Visual Studio specific. Okay, I write some code using GCC, and doesn't have that same structure, you know. When I retire, which won't be too long, I'm going to write some Java, and it definitely won't have that Visual Studio structure. Okay, so building in a Visual Studio structure in your repository means you can't use it for anything but Visual Studio code, and anybody else will have a hard time using it, even though they're using Visual Studio.
So basically, maybe solution is the wrong word. Like should there be a browse by projects where projects can be a group of packages together? Is that
It would be very reasonable. See, you really have that because you have dependency relationships. So if you went to executive, my executive depends on persist and blah, 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 okay? So I really have it in the metadata. It's there. I don't have to supply it, okay? And oh, by the way, you know, Tianyu, I could use the metadata to set up directories and load the files into them, okay? That would, you know, thank you for asking those questions and holding my feet to the fire, because I think that's a really nice solution. You just store them in and use the metadata to reconstruct the directories where you want to put them. Nice, nice. You know, again, you're not obligated to, there's no requirement to do that, you know. So. Yes? There are directories missing from that. I put a little post on somebody, so I think it was Tian Yu sent me an email, or somebody sent me an email saying, you got bugs in your file system. And as far as I know, there are no bugs in the file system. I don't believe there are, but the file demo assumed that there were a bunch of directories, and I didn't capture those directories when I uploaded it. And so it fails because it can't open those directories. That's all. And I said in my Piazza post that I would fix the demo simply by not making those calls into those directories. That's how I'm going to fix it. Okay. So, but yes.
So you want to
Jessica.
Yeah. So you want to maintain a directory inside the repository, and then I'm assuming based on what you just said, you want files that have dependency on each other to be in the same directory?
No, I don't. I don't think the directory structure should be dependent on file dependencies. I would do it. Let's imagine that we're all working on a big 10 million line of code project, okay? And so we'll have a display subsystem, and we'll have this kind of subsystem, that kind of subsystem, this other kind of subsystem. I would have a directory for each subsystem, but some files in this subsystem will depend on files in that subsystem. Okay.
So they're still separate.
Yeah. You know, if I do what you say, I have to have one file for the whole project, because here's this guy at the top, and he depends on everybody going down, so it's, by definition, it has to be, according to that, you know, scenario, they would all have to be in the same directory, and I don't think that's a good idea.
It can simply map to a package in the original code, for example, that the code in the same package.
But if you have 10,000 packages in the repository, do you really want 10,000 directories? I don't. So I would simply use directories as an optimization tool to make searches easier and quicker. Okay. And that normally, you know, I think were I using this repository myself, it would be based on, some of it would be based on technology. I'd have a C++ directory, you know, and then, but below that, I might have a tools, you know, a tools directory and a demo directory and a something, you know. So it would be, the directory would really be application specific, you know, how you know, or your team wants to use the the repository. Okay.
I don't think I read there's a requirement for making a directory inside the repository. And then
So which requirement are we talking about?
Not really, just in general, like how
Is there a requirement here? I don't remember there being a requirement. Might be. I think it's a good idea to have directories, but just in the sense we talked about. Okay? Other questions? Yes? What's your name?
Pei.
Pei. You're J Pei?
Yeah.
What's the J stand for?
That's my Chinese name. First capital.
Can you pronounce your Chinese name for?
It is very difficult to pronounce.
Yeah.
Don't try.
I don't want you to Christmas. Well, just say it for me.
Jiahao.
Jiahao. Pei Jiahao. Was that so bad? Not too good. Pei Jiahao. Okay, anyway. Jianan is sitting there laughing. He's smiling. I know Dr. Chen has told me a million times, don't try to use her Chinese names. Everybody gets so tired of hearing you mispronounce her names. But,
It is the same character with Jana. Yeah.
okay,
In Chinese.
yeah. So J Pei, what's your question?
So
You forgot it.
that you mentioned you will add the ownership requirement.
So where's the ownership requirement? I didn't. That's an oversight. Which
You talk about this.
which I will fix. There will be version 1.2 that adds ownership, an ownership requirement. It'll be simple, you know. All it will be is a requirement to implement and state in comments for that package your ownership policy. So you can do anything you want. But
It will be a separate package.
I think so. Send me an email. So, Amar, send me an email about it. I'll think about it a little bit. I don't want to do anything that makes it, I don't want you to tear apart your code, you know. I'll try to word it in a way that you can implement it any way you want without, you know, I won't say there has to be a package for it. I think it probably would be a good design to have a package for it, but I will, you know, ownership, if you don't explicitly define an ownership policy, you are defining one implicitly. What that means is, without thinking, there will be an ownership policy which probably won't be very good because you didn't think about it. Okay. So, might not, you know, the actions might not be consistent, self-consistent with any ownership policy. So.
And, does the project you uploaded name the process used for browsing, so displaying the code pop-up?
Say this again?
You have uploaded the project about process.
Uh-huh.
Displaying the process. So
Yeah.
does it use for displaying the requirement of browsing to show pop-up code pop-up?
It's there to allow you to really easily. I never make any claims that it satisfies all the requirements, so I'm not saying you can just take that, stick it in, not do anything with it, and it satisfies the requirement. That's not true. But you don't have to do anything more than pop up in a programmatic way, in a programmed way, say, I'm about to browse this file, here's its metadata, here's its source code, pop up comes a window with the source code. Okay, that's fine. That's all you got to do. Okay? Yes?
You said we should have the metadata like description and author or check-in in that database.
I think check-in should not be the open and closed check-in should not be in metadata. I think it should be in your payload.
Yes.
Okay.
So the payload you give us, we still need.
I don't have check-in. I don't have that in my payload. I'm not saying that my payload does everything you need your payload to do in your repository. No, this is just my solution for project 1. It has nothing to do with your it's not purporting to satisfy everything you need out of your database for project 2. Doesn't claim to do that. Okay.
The key to that value in this database should be the name with version number, right?
It should be namespace : file name .extension .version number. Yep. That way you're guaranteed to be unique. Other questions? Yes.
Professor, when I see the requirement 3, the first idea is that the check-in, check-out, and version browses things should be the member functions of the repository core. But in your requirement, I see that these should be the classes. We should implement some functions in it.
I think they should be more than member functions. I think they should be classes and probably have their own packages.
So, can I know why they should be the classes?
So check-in, okay? Check-in does quite a bit of stuff. So if you put it in one member function, so a member function should have single responsibility. But check-in is too heavyweight a responsibility for a poor old benighted member function, okay? It really needs its own class. Check-in will have some temporary data and all that sort of stuff, And so you don't want to make your repository core have to hold all the data for check-in and stuff like that. The check-in component should do that. Okay, that's why. Yes.
If I'm in repository, if I want to store 2 different projects which are independent, they might have same namespace and same file name.
They almost certainly won't have the same namespace.
Those 2 projects are independent, so people can have same namespace and same file name.
It's possible, but it's very bad practice to do that. This repository is being used in one company. Basically, what you should do is fail the check-in if the thing that's being checked in matches something that's already in the repository and the authors are different. End of story. You fail the check-in. And you tell them why. Okay? There's something that already exists in the repository and you're not the author. And that tells them they got to do something, like change the namespace or whatever. Okay? So if there's something, if somebody checks in something and it matches something that's already in the repository and they're not the author, you fail the check-in. Right? Right. Other questions? Yes?
So you would want to basically put all the new data, for example, the check-in, open, ownership, in the payload? You don't want to add it to the metadata?
I don't want to change the metadata. I would consider it a design flaw if you change the metadata because now you're taking this nice reusable NoSQL database and making it specific to the repository.
But then we're making the payload very specific.
Oh yeah, because the payload is the interchangeable part. The payload is the way we extend it. Okay, we're not changing the NoSQL database, we're just changing the payload.
Do you still want the inheritance and template?
Well, I chose to do that extension with a template. You could have used inheritance in that case, but I think using the template is a better choice. Okay, simply because there's no reason, you're not going to change that at runtime. Okay, so. All Right? Other questions? Are we done? Yes.
Can you elaborate the namespace policy? When do we need a new namespace, package, a namespace, or a solution?
I think you should always supply a namespace, always supply a namespace, file name, dot extension, dot, and you don't supply the version number, the repository supplies the version number. So that means that you always supply a namespace. Now, you know, there is a global namespace, and that global namespace has an empty name, and you could do that, but now what you're doing is making it very likely that there will be future check-ins that will fail simply because they also use the global namespace. You know, I think using a specific namespace is a good idea. And I would just use the one that in your file.
Yeah, I mean, in general, when we create a new package, do we need a same namespace with the package name?
Well, no. So okay. So I got your drift. So what's your name?
Chen.
Chen?
Yeah.
C-H-E-N?
E-N-G. And
Oh, Chen.
Yeah.
Chen. Okay. So so I might be building some prototypes that really aren't part of a project per se. They're just things I'm thinking about and working on, and so I want to supply them. Then I think it would make a sense to provide them with experiment : file name or prototype : file name. So you just use, you know, the kind of thing you're doing as the namespace. I'm building a prototype or I'm building a demo. You know, if I stored my demo code in it, I would probably use the demo namespace.
So it depends on the functionality?
You know, most users it doesn't, you know, because we're using this repository in a big project and we're all working on this big project, okay? And we'll just use the namespaces that are inherent in that project. But if I want to say I'm using this for my personal use and I'm just experimenting with some files and I want to put it in the repository so I can come back and work on it later on and I know where to find it, then just making a namespace for that, you know, like experiment or prototype is fine, or demo, okay? Yeah. It would be nice if your repository, perhaps at its top level, displayed all the namespaces that were used. How am I going to keep track of that? One way would be to use another NoSQL database just to hold it. You could. Okay. You know, maybe using a NoSQL. You know, I could see having 2 NoSQL databases in a repository. I don't think you should do that for project 2. You know, it's more work. But I might well elect myself to have 2 NoSQL databases in my repository. One that's responsible for managing all the files, and one that's responsible for managing user properties and, you know, display things, you know, keeping track of all the namespaces so I can, when I first open up the repository, what I see is the display of all the namespaces. And somebody can click to go into the namespace. You know. Might make sense. And they're small, lightweight. A repository isn't very big. You know. When I zipped up my entire repository project, including all the stuff, after cleaning it, it was, I think, 2 megabytes or something. You know, wasn't very big. So. How we doing, everybody? Some are doing okay, some are not doing okay. Amar will be doing his thing this evening at 5 o'clock, right, Amar? And, you know, he's a very knowledgeable young man and will be happy to help you with, you know, basic questions.
Sometimes we are unable to remove the default headers from the Visual Studio.
Sometimes you're unable to what?
Default headers, which comes with the Visual Studio project.
The
We remove also it's saying the header file is missing stdafx.h.
Oh, what I do is I tend to use there is a project wizard if you go to the project,
I tried that also.
and it doesn't. You can unclick the SDF. So here's what you can remove them. Here's what you got to do. You can just delete the stdfx.h and .cpp. Then you got to go into the properties and set it for no precompiled headers. Yeah.
It's saying we are missing that.
It won't once you change it to no.
No, also I have changed.
I do that all the time, and
I
it
also
doesn't.
did in my project, but it's still no active project. When I submit an empty directory, it's saying you have to supply stdfx.h. After doing all this.
Well, if you use the wizard, and tell it no precompiled headers, then it won't demand them. Okay, because it sets that property the way it ought to be. One second, let me say, guys, I don't know whether there's going to be a second wave or not, but I would invite anybody, all you guys have been asking lots of questions, get up and leave, but any of you who are really struggling to get your act together and figure out what's going on, you're invited to stay and ask more questions if you want, I don't know whether there'll be another wave. So there is another wave coming in. So, but anyway, you're still invited. It'll be a small wave, so you're invited to do that.
Interesting the file, the size number function in file info is I don't know it is machine specific or it is depend on my machine is error. So if I copy a file to a to path or to a target path and I check its size, it will return its size will return a 0. But actually I copied it into a correct path, which is this path, and to this name .1. But this function return me that this file has a size of 0. But actually, I'm sorry. Where is test? But actually, I think But this file has a correct size.
I don't know why it's telling you it's 0. I've never seen that.
Yeah.
So I don't know why it's telling you that. This is Explorer that's telling you it's 0, or Visual Studio or whatever is telling you. Who's telling you that it's 0? Visual Studio?
Yeah, I add a debug output which can tell me its size.
So what do you mean you're adding a debug element that can tell you its size?
I add an intermediate output which say out the target file size by using a
Oh, okay. File info size. So you're saying that my file info size might be returning a wrong answer?
Probably.
Send me an email about it and I'll look at it.
Okay. Send to your email box or
send it to my email in. You're welcome to comment it on Piazza if you want, but send a message to my email of the J Fawcett, and I'll look at it. I'm gonna work on the demo, fix the demo.
I have some a little suggestion on the file class in your file system. Since it has a constructor that must let user to pass in a file spec into itself. So why don't you make all your member function like exist, remove, and another file function, a member function that includes a parameter called file spec. Make it default equals to
Could make the default equal to 0.
Yeah, because when I
that'd be
use
reasonable.
it, I need to repass in the files back into it. It is.
Yeah, it might make it a little easier. Why don't you include that in the email when I look at the file system? You know, your suggestion sounds like it would make it easier to use, you know. So I'll think about putting it in.
Yeah, because I don't want. I don't.
Yeah.
I cannot change it because violates principle.
I wouldn't take off points from you if in your project you said you put a little note. You know how I put text files at the top of my project? If you put a little text file that said, I have changed filesystem.h and filesystem.cpp to make it easier to use, I don't think, you know, I wouldn't treat that as a violation of the open and close principle. You know, if file system were, I don't know, we're getting into a gray area here. It really is, in a sense, violating the open and close principle, but I don't think it's I think it's a very reasonable thing for you to do. I think what I would do if I were you is, you know, if you had some resource like that, you'd say, I am renaming this resource to my file system or something, okay, and then changing because I think it would be easier to use with these modifications. Why don't you do that? That makes it easier to do, okay. So. Yep.
And more, there is when you're using in your directory class, there is also a remove function. But you are using an API that can only remove empty directory. But if the directory
no, I did that on purpose. If you remove, allowing somebody to remove a directory that isn't empty allows somebody to accidentally go to C:, and say remove, and they wipe their whole disk. So I did that intentionally, and I won't change that. That's intentionally done.
When I want to init my repository working directory, I need to delete.
So okay, so you can write a function that uses that wraps my remove, that removes everything. But I refuse to make that because I think it's dangerous. Yep.
Regarding checkout,
why don't you sit down and, you know, were you in here for the first wave?
Yeah.
Sit down anyway, and because I want to get started. Guys, if you're not going to stay, why don't you leave so I can work with the second wave? It's okay. One second. Just let me get this done. Okay.
For the zip files, because you suggested that they would do the zip file thing, and probably a lot of them will. How do you suggest they manage zip files? Like inside the repository, how do they open?
I think they should. They don't. They treat it like an ordinary file. But when they view it, their viewer should perhaps just say this is a zip file, can't view, or something like that. Something simple.
They're not essentially developing a real viewer right now.
No. All they're doing is they're popping up in their browser. They should say, here's the metadata and here's the source text using the process pop-up that I gave them.
Yeah.
Okay, that's all. But now, if it's a zip file, they'll just say, this is a zip file, can't view. Or you could show the metadata for the zip file, but you won't pop up a. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, because I looked for some C++ libraries for zip files. And
Oh yeah, but I
there's
don't
no
want
standard.
to. You know, you could do that, but I don't want people to get into that. I really
Yeah,
don't.
There's no
Yes.
standard, so
Yeah.
that's a problem.
Yeah.
Anyway, for the daytime class, I'm trying to make it as as close as possible. I'm designing a different one, just
Okay.
I'm following C# design, and they use the calendar, they use the different local.
Be careful.
Yeah.
Calendar stuff is very hard to get right.
Yeah.
Because of leap years, and calendars are really hard to get right. So I wouldn't write my own calendar. I wouldn't. I absolutely would not. That's
no
one that
standard,
falls
right?
into that category. There's a accepted way to do it, but it's complicated.
Yeah.
So that falls into the category of I got a good C++ chrono facility. I got a good C# facility. Why would I? I don't want to do. I'm sure Java has a facility.
Yeah.
So I if you do, you're welcome to, but don't give it to anybody else because it will be buggy. The calendar part will be buggy. I promise you. Okay. If you go back 3,000 years, you'll be off by 2 days or whatever. Just because. Good morning, everybody. That wasn't very enthusiastic. So, I want to start out by talking about something that probably won't be useful for project 2, but will be useful for project 4, and illustrates what we talked about this week. Okay? And you guys who are sitting in again from the first wave, just sit tight, So, I want to talk about extensions. Now, suppose we want to build a file manager for navigation. Okay? Not very hard to do at all. So we say something like search. This is just pseudocode, okay? So I'm not going to put in types and all that stuff. Just pseudo. This is just pseudocode. So search says find files. No, it says find files. And then it says for each file, notify. And then it says find directories. For each dir notify, and so it says for each dir notify and search dir. So let's make this all nicely consistent. Okay, just a little pseudocode for a directory navigator, really simple, recursive, just recursively walking down the directory tree. Great. So how do we make this? Suppose we decided that this is a nice little utility, not very big, but we want to stick this away in our utility folder, and I don't want to make it application specific. So for your project 4, you're going to have some application. When you find a file, there's something application specific you need to do. When you find a dir, there's something application specific you need to do. How do we make this extensible so that we don't bind any application specific detail in this navigator?
Using an interface, virtual.
That is one solution, but you're two clicks down. So what did we talk about this week as means for extensibility? Inheritance, right. We also talked about something else. We also talked about something else. Templates! You've forgotten templates already! Okay, so your immediate reaction when somebody says, okay, now how are you going to keep from polluting that with application-specific stuff? You say to the interviewer, either templates or inheritance. Bang! And they smile at you. Okay. So templates or inheritance. Okay, so let's explore that space a little bit. So, file manager extensions. Doggone it. So I can do a template, and I could say something like, again, this is just pseudocode, you know, file manager, bracket of app nav, where app nav has functions, do file, and do dir name. Okay? Clearly that'll work. So each application just supplies its own app nav, and all app nav does is a class that defines those two functions. It does whatever that application needs for those functions to do. Maybe it saves one of those functions into, maybe it saves a directory name into a database, or you know, maybe it displays the file name or something, whatever it needs to do. So that's one way to make it nicely reusable. Now with inheritance, there's really two ways to do that. Right? So inheritance, I can provide base file manager and provide, and so base file manager has virtual do file equals 0, virtual do dir equals 0. I wish I could type. And we provide a derived class with implement do file and do dir. Piece of cake. There's one thing that is not very flexible about this solution. Solution, fine. Suppose I have several places in my code that need to do different things with that information in the file. In one place I'm storing it, in another place I'm displaying it. Okay? So that means I would have to have two derived classes that have, all of the file manager stuff. So there's a variation on that theme that thins that down. It's called the command pattern. So we can use inheritance with command pattern. So what we do is we provide a hook class, inav, and file manager has a function to register instances instances that implement inav. And then applications implement classes derived from inav, and register with file manager. And now file manager invokes for each registered instance the do file or do dir method as appropriate. Okay? So the only real difference, this is inheritance, the difference is that instead of having a bunch of file manager things plunked around, now I have a bunch of these little command objects, and the model is probably they're smaller, lighter weight, and the only thing you're doing really, the only thing you're doing differently is that the model is that you're duplicating some lightweight thing instead of some heavier weight thing. Otherwise, they're really accomplish the same thing. Okay?
The inav will have do file and do dir in that case.
They will be pure virtual functions. inav will have pure virtual functions, do file and do dir, just like the base file. Okay. So now the base file manager doesn't have those virtual functions. What it has are functions that simply it has a do file. Okay. And as it's trundling around, it just calls its own do file, and all do file does is it goes down its list of for each pointer in my collection, do file with that name. Okay, piece of cake. So, open close principles satisfied. Okay, dependency inversion satisfied. Right. So I like this example because, it's so small. You might say, I don't need. I'll just write it. In any place I want it, I'll write those 10 lines of code. Okay, but that's something that you do often enough that it might be useful just to put it in your in a little utilities package. So, but it nicely illustrates that pattern. And I think probably your client in Project 4 will need something like this. It's got to go find files, to send to for check-in and check-out, stuff like that. So for example, I could put not only that search capability, but I might well provide in the file manager capability of storing files, and stuff like that. That the kind of stuff that you would need on a client side. But in any case, nice way to make stuff reusable. Okay, so with that, let's talk about Project 2. Are there any other questions beside Project 2? Okay, let's talk about Project 2 then. So, are any of you going to use my NoSQL database? It's okay to raise your hand. It's okay. No penalty for raising your hand, But, of those who are going to use it, is it clear how to go about using it? I talked about that a little bit in class, that I set up this executive. I use my executive. My executive creates a static library, and I had a test application that illustrate using that executive. And so if you drop my project into your project 2 solution folder, then you can access the headers. The issue is that the header files have paths. Each of the Visual Studio is stored at each of them down in their own project directory, and so I have these relative paths to get to them, and so I can't just pull them all up and put them into some header file, include directory. So it's easiest just to drop the project in, and then you could, if you wanted to, you could remove the projects and remove the the log, the debug, and all that kind of stuff. You don't need any of that. All you need are the static library from the main debug file and folder and the header files. An alternate is simply to copy all the headers out, remove their relative paths, put them in a include folder, so they're all there in the NoSQL.h aggregating header, and all the other headers, and you remove all the relative paths from them, and then now, then you don't have to. All you need then is one include folder and one live folder, and everything will work. But. Okay, questions about the requirements? Yes, Rohit.
Like in checkout, we remove the version number of those files and then keep those files in a separate directory, right?
So when you remove the version number, I would immediately remove. I would not remove the version number until that file was just before I sent that file to the client. And I would never store a versionless file in my repository. Okay? I might have a staging directory where I put them, remove the version numbers, send them to the client, and then I would clear that version directory. Because I don't think you should have files kicking around that didn't have version numbers in a repository. An invariant of the repository is everything you put in it is versioned.
The file that client will be getting will not have...
They will not. They are removed.
Yeah, so when the client wants to check in that same file, so how do we check in the DB that, okay, this version file is in open or closed?
So what happens is the last check-in, the client has either closed it or left it open. I would, by default, when you check in, have it an open check-in, And until the client closes that check-in, it's open. And so if I put a file of that name, that namespace colon file name dot extension, no, dot ext, but no version number, when the client checks that in, okay, it looks for that file name, finds it, finds the current version, checks its own storage to see, it checks the payload for that element to see whether it's closed or not. If it's open, it just overwrites it. It adds the current extension to the file and overwrites it. If it is closed, it creates a new version, puts that new version in the file, stores it as a new version. So it creates a new database element now with that new version. Okay?
And yeah, one more thing, like regarding traversing of the class. Like once we are done with traversing related files, so you told like all the visited state should be reset.
All the visitors, all the what?
We will have a visited member.
Oh, yeah, this is, so for traversal,
Yeah.
because you may have dependency cycles, you need a visited mark, and that really should go in the payload. It shouldn't go in metadata.
Yeah, so once we are done, we have to do it for each and every file in the DB or just...
Oh, no, I definitely wouldn't. Somebody has asked for a file. And so you just go and get its children, and you get its children's children, and and so you're probably traversing 1% of the, and you don't mark any others. You only mark what you visited, okay? And now you have to unmark them,
Yeah.
okay?
So that's what I'm saying. Like how to do that, unmark all those.
So the easiest thing to do is. You do the same kind of traversal again. It's not going to be very big because it's just the dependencies for that one particular file. You do the traversal again and you unmark, but you got to unmark on the way back. If you unmark on the way forward, so you got to use a tail recursion, not a head. If you unmark with a head recursion, then you'll start spinning in cycles, okay, because you already unmarked it. But if you wait until you back out and then unmark it, that's fine. Okay? Right? Right, Yul?
I have a question. To do, for example, when we mention, like, if you checked out a file, and if that file, for example, has, they say, 5 another 5 dependent on it, would the design be fine if I simply created on a fly a simple map to actually?
Oh yeah. In fact, that's easier, and I think that's a really good idea. So what Yul's suggesting is that as you're traversing it, you just keep adding those keys into the. It doesn't even have to be a map. Okay, but because once it can just be an unordered set. Okay, you add the key in, and now every time you come to a new node, visit a new node, you say, are you in the set? If you are, back out. If you aren't, okay. And then at the end, so if you make this in a local scope, let it go out of scope and it's gone. So that's a good scheme. I like it.
Do we require a set, or should a vector works?
The only problem with the vector is you got to search it. So you're constantly searching this. Every time you come to a new node, you search it. So the model is that a set would be faster, but that's not necessarily true. A linear search on a small vector might be faster than a constant time search on a small set. It's hard to tell, okay. But I would probably elect to use a set because if I'm in a case where it doesn't matter, then it really doesn't matter, and so I'll use a set. And if it's a case where it does matter, I'll get significantly better performance by using a set. So I would opt for the best worst case performance, which is which you get by using a set. Okay? Each
same version of the same file will have a different description in the payload.
Okay.
So,
It might not, but that's okay.
So in the database, so I will have version underscore version 1 underscore version 2 as the keys.
As the key. So the key is namespace : file name dot extension dot version, and that guarantees it is unique.
So when I check in a new file with the same file name,
Yep.
not
Then you have to see whether that check-in is closed or not. If the check-in is open, you just add that latest version number to it, and you overwrite that file.
how do I find out the latest version number of that file?
You got to store it.
Okay, in the suppose my file name is.
So you don't need to store. It's there in the key. Okay. So.
So I'll have to search for all the keys. So I suppose 6 versions of the same file.
So your point well taken. You certainly could do it by searching the keys, but that's a linear operation, and there's potentially lots of keys in the repository. So what you might choose to do is simply have an auxiliary map that has file names and holds the latest version number. Okay, and that's quick. So now I come in with a file name and I grab the latest version. Okay.
And if the same file, I want to see what all versions are present for that file. And then
you could, there's no requirement to do that. That's a good thing to do, okay? But it'll be fairly easy. If you have, so you could modify what I told you just a tiny bit. You could have a map with a namespace : file name dot extension, no version, and its value is a list of all the versions. So if I need the latest one, I can get it. If I want to traverse my version list, I can do that really quickly.
So you're saying I can have a simple file name, suppose Angular.cpp.
Yep.
And in that payload of that, I can store all the versions of the
Sure.
files.
Sure. Absolutely.
Just for seeing what all the versions are there, and then that's all.
Yeah. There's another possible way to do it. Remember that the NoSQL database, the DB core, really is a skinny little wrapper around a map, right? And so if you wanted to, you could use one NoSQL database to track all the files in a repository and another to track the kind of information we're talking about. Makes sense? Okay. Easy to do. They're small. Those NoSQL databases aren't big. Okay.
Professor?
Yeah.
The user will give us maybe a batch of files to check in, and
You're going to check them in one at a time.
one at a time. So in actuality, our local as well as the client, a client as well as the server is the same system right now.
Right now, yeah.
So we'll actually perform the copy operation
Yep.
from one designated location to the root.
Yep.
vice
Yep.
versa.
And I think that when you check in a file, the client should tell the repository the source path.
So
I don't think the client should be copying into repository directories. That's under the repository's control.
yeah. So for example, in my test cases text executive, I am going to maybe create a map of the path what the client is specifying. He wants to submit the files along with the DB element. Maybe the DB element is the metadata which the user is supposed to provide. Right? Just to demonstrate.
I think I would be inclined in my client while you're in the process of building that, you could just create a DB element and store it. You're not going to send the DB element to the repository, but it's a way for you to assemble at your leisure, you know, all the information about that check-in. Okay. And then,
How would I transfer the metadata information? If
well, you know, I've got to leave some stuff for you to do. Okay. You know, you definitely, I would think about it this way. Here's a good way to think about it.